George never had a taste for gambling. It wasn't just disinterest, it was something deeper, something rooted in the past. His uncle, a man he had admired as a child, had lost everything to it. The man had started with small bets, just friendly games with coworkers, but over time, the thrill consumed him. He borrowed money, made bad decisions, and when the debts became too much, he vanished from George's life. Years later, George learned that his uncle had died alone, drowning in debt and regret. That kind of loss left a mark. It taught George that gambling wasn't just a game. It was destruction disguised as entertainment. Megan, on the other hand, saw it differently. She was radiant, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they'd known her forever. She had a way of making people laugh, of turning dull moments into something worth remembering. And she loved poker. Not just the game, but the strategy, the psychology behind it. She had a natural talent for reading people, for bluffing, for making them think she was holding nothing when, in reality, she had them right where she wanted. At first, George didn't mind. It was just a hobby, just a way for her to unwind. Every couple of weeks, Megan would host a poker night at their house. The living room would be filled with the sounds of shuffling cards, clinking glasses, and bursts of laughter. George never played. He never even touched the cards. Instead, he'd sit with the wives of the other players, making polite conversation while they drank wine and swapped stories about their kids or their jobs. It was a routine, and he let it be. Megan was good at the game, and it wasn't like she was betting anything they couldn't afford to lose. But there was a moment, one single evening, when all of that changed. It started like any other poker night. The usual group had gathered around the table, drinks in hand, ready to test their luck. George barely paid attention to the game itself. He was in the kitchen with Lisa and Claire, talking about some TV show Megan had gotten them all hooked on, when he noticed the shift in tone from the other room. The laughter had died down. The conversation had turned hushed, tense. George wasn't the type to intrude on Megan's games, but something about that night didn't sit right with him. When he stepped into the living room, the air felt different. Megan was sitting at the head of the table, her expression unreadable, but there was something in her eyes he didn't like. Across from her sat Daniel, a newer addition to the group, a man with sharp features and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was leaning back in his chair, one hand resting casually on the stack of chips in front of him. George didn't know much about poker, but he knew that this wasn't just a friendly game anymore. The stacks of chips in front of each player were much larger than usual. The energy in the room had shifted. There was no more casual banter, no more lighthearted teasing. Just silence and tension. "Megan," George said, keeping his voice calm. "What's going on?" She didn't look at him. She just stared at her cards, her fingers tapping against the table in that steady rhythm she always did when she was deep in thought. "Final hand," she murmured. "All or nothing." George's stomach twisted. "All or nothing. What does that mean?" Daniel smirked. "It means your wife's got guts," he said, glancing at Megan. Biggest bet of the night. George's heart pounded. He didn't know exactly what was at stake, but he knew Megan. He knew that when she got caught up in the thrill of the game, she could be reckless. He stepped closer to the table, lowering his voice. "Megan, what did you bet?" She finally looked at him, and for the first time in their marriage, he saw something in her eyes that scared him. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't confidence. It was fear, a flicker of doubt. "Just trust me," she whispered. But George didn't. Not this time. The night started like any other. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the clink of whiskey glasses. Megan and George were at their friend's house, a sprawling estate owned by Victor, a man with more money than sense, who loved hosting poker nights that teetered between social gatherings and high-stakes battlegrounds. George never liked these nights, but Megan did, and so, like always, he went along. The stakes were usually manageable, just enough to keep things interesting, but tonight felt different. There was an edge to the game, a sharpness in the air that put George on edge. Megan was in her element, flashing that confident smile, reading her opponents like an open book. But then came Robert. He had been at a few games before, But tonight he was different, bolder, louder, hungrier. He sat across from Megan, grinning like a man who had already won. The game dragged on, each hand bringing the stakes higher. George wasn't paying much attention at first, lost in polite conversation with a few of the other guests. But then he heard it, the unmistakable tension in Megan's voice as she called an all-in. He turned just in time to see her push forward a mountain of chips, her face unreadable. His stomach dropped. "Megan," he said, stepping closer to the table. She barely glanced at him. "I got this," she murmured. Robert's grin widened. He didn't hesitate. He matched her bet without blinking, sliding forward his own pile of chips with a cocky smirk. The cards were dealt. Megan's hands were steady as she laid hers down. A flush. It should have been enough. It would have been enough if Robert didn't turn over a full house. Silence. George felt the blood drain from his face as Megan's shoulders tensed. She had lost. The room shifted, people whispering, some glancing at George, waiting to see his reaction. Robert leaned forward, his voice smooth and taunting. "Tough break, Megan. That's what, 50 grand? Megan swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "That's the number," she said. Robert chuckled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "That's a hell of a debt to owe." "We'll pay." George cut in, his voice firm. "We'll figure it out." But Robert was still grinning, shaking his head. "Come on, George. We both know you don't have that kind of money lying around." He turned back to Megan, eyes glinting. "But I'll tell you what. I'm a generous man. Let's make things interesting." Megan didn't respond, but the way she inhaled sharply told George she already knew where this was going. "One night," Robert said smoothly. "With me." The room was so silent that George could hear his own pulse hammering in his ears. He stepped forward, barely containing his rage. "That's not happening." Megan hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Robert tilted his head. 50 grand is a lot of money, but a bet's a bet. And unless you got a better way to settle it, he let the words hang. George turned to Megan, disbelief hitting him like a freight train. Megan? She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked onto the table, her breathing shallow. "No," George said, shaking his head. "Absolutely not." She finally turned to him, and there it was again, that flicker of fear. But behind it, something else. Desperation. Before he could say another word, he felt hands clamp down on his shoulders. "Let's not make a scene, buddy." George twisted his head to see David and Patrick, two of Robert's lackeys, standing behind him. They weren't just poker buddies. They were enforcers, men who knew how to keep things under control. "You're not touching her," George growled, trying to yank himself free. David tightened his grip. "Easy now." Megan stood up, her hands trembling slightly. "Maybe." "No." George snapped, fury igniting inside him. "No, maybe. We're leaving." But Robert just chuckled. "Seems like Megan's a big girl. Maybe she should decide for herself." George saw red. With a roar, he shoved back against David and Patrick, wrenching himself free. They weren't expecting the sheer force of his rage, and as soon as his arms were loose, he swung. His fist connected with Robert's face, a sickening crunch filling the air as his nose exploded in a spray of blood. Robert howled, stumbling back, clutching his face. The room erupted into chaos, people shouting, scrambling back from the table. George wasn't done. Adrenaline pumped through his veins as he turned, his eyes locking onto the massive antique sideboard against the wall. It was easily 700 pounds, a hulking piece of wood that had stood there for decades. Without thinking, he lunged. He dug his fingers beneath its edge, adrenaline giving him strength beyond reason. And with a guttural roar, he heaved. The sideboard tipped. Time seemed to slow as it crashed onto the marble floor, splintering into 1,000 pieces, shattering glasses and sending debris flying. People screamed, and then silence. George stood there, chest heaving, fist clenched. Robert groaned, still holding his bleeding nose. David and Patrick were frozen in place, uncertain whether to grab him again or let him be. Megan was staring at him, wide-eyed, her hands covering her mouth. George turned to her, his voice ragged. "We're leaving. Now!" No one stopped them, but as they walked out, George knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. George drove. He didn't know exactly where he was going, just that he had to get away. Away from the house, away from Megan, away from everything. The anger still burned inside him, but beneath it, there was something worse, disgust. Not just at Megan, not just at Robert and the rest of those gamblers, but at himself. For trusting her, for not seeing it sooner. The neon sign of the motel flickered weakly in the distance as he pulled into the lot. It was one of those roadside places, the kind that smelled like old carpet and regret, but it didn't matter. He just needed a place to breathe. 55 miles. That's how far he'd driven before he stopped. Far enough that Megan wouldn't come looking. Far enough that he could try to piece together what the hell had just happened. The room was as bad as he expected. A stiff bed, a small TV, a bathroom with a shower that probably hadn't been deep cleaned in years. He tossed his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, running his hands over his face. His knuckles still ached from where he'd hit Robert. The image of Megan, frozen in fear and shame, flashed through his mind, but he shoved it away. He was done thinking about her. 2 hours later, there was a knock at his door. George frowned. He hadn't told anyone where he was. The only people who might have guessed were the ones back at that house, and he doubted any of them would have the nerve to come after him. He opened the door and found Sarah and Emma standing there. Sarah, 38, petite but with sharp eyes that never missed anything. Emma, 40, taller, blonde, with the kind of quiet confidence that made people listen when she spoke. They were both dressed casually, jeans, jackets, but their eyes told him this wasn't just a friendly visit. "We need to talk," Sarah said. George stepped aside, letting them in. Emma glanced around the motel room and smirked. "Nice place. Really going all out, huh?" "Didn't exactly have time to book a suite," George muttered, shutting the door. "Why are you two here?" Sarah leaned against the small dresser, folding her arms. "Because what happened tonight was a disaster. And not just for you." George narrowed his eyes. "Megan lost the bet. That's on her." "Of course it is," Emma said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "But you didn't just humiliate Robert. You humiliated all of them. You flipped the table, so to speak." "Good," George said flatly. Sarah exchanged a glance with Emma before stepping closer. "That's why we're here, to offer you a way to even the score." George frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Emma smirked. "Let's just say Megan's not the only one who's been reckless. Those men at that table, they're not exactly loyal husbands. And we," she gestured between herself and Sarah, "are tired of being the ones left in the dark." George's stomach tightened. He wasn't stupid. He knew what they were suggesting. But hearing it out loud, seeing the way Sarah's lips curled into a knowing smile, the way Emma crossed her legs and leaned back like she had all the time in the world, made it real. "You want to sleep with me?" George said, just to hear it. Sarah's smile widened. "Oh, we don't just want to. We've decided to." Emma tilted her head. "Unless, of course, you're not interested." George exhaled slowly. He should have been shocked. He should have felt guilty or angry, or at least conflicted. But all he felt was an odd, twisted sense of satisfaction. If Megan could throw away their marriage over a game, why shouldn't he take something back? Still, something didn't sit right. "So that's it?" he asked. "Revenge?" Emma shrugged. "Call it what you want. We just think it's time for some balance." George looked between them. Two women, both beautiful, both completely sure of what they were offering. And maybe it was the whiskey still burning in his gut, or the rage that hadn't settled, or maybe he was just done caring. But he said yes. He let Sarah kiss him first, her lips soft, urgent, tasting like wine and something sweeter. Emma joined seconds later, her hands already pulling at his shirt. And while they thought they were setting the rules, George had already made his own. Before they had arrived, when he had been pacing the motel room, replaying the night over and over, an idea had formed. a way to make sure Megan, Robert, and the rest of them knew exactly who had the last word. So before Sarah and Emma showed up, he had placed a small camera, barely noticeable, on the dresser, angled just right. If they wanted revenge, fine, but George wasn't done getting his. George barely slept. When Sarah and Emma left in the early morning, their lips still tasting of whiskey and rebellion, he sat alone in the dim motel room, staring at the flickering screen of his laptop. The file was already open, the video, raw and uncut, capturing everything from the moment they walked in to the moment they left. He watched it once, his jaw tight, fingers gripping the edges of the table. Then he watched it again, and again, not because he wanted to relive it, but because he needed to make sure he had everything he needed. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about control. By the time the sun rose, George had turned a night of betrayal into something else entirely. The video was trimmed, edited, the sound sharpened so that every whispered word, every moan, every touch was crystal clear. But the most damning parts? Those he turned into still images, a few keystrokes, and the printer hummed to life. One by one, the photos slid out, ink still fresh, capturing moments that would destroy marriages, friendships, reputations. Sarah's fingers digging into his shoulders, Emma's lips trailing down his chest, their faces caught in that perfect moment of reckless pleasure. By the time he was finished, there was a neat stack of glossy prints laid out before him. Checkmate. That evening, George made his way back to the house where everything had fallen apart. Victor had been the one to arrange the meeting. Apparently, word had spread that George had skipped town, and the poker group wanted to discuss things like men. What that really meant was Robert licking his wounds, David and Patrick looking for a reason to swing their weight around, and the others wanting reassurance that their dirty little gambling club hadn't completely imploded. Good. Let them think they were in control. George walked in without hesitation, carrying a manila folder under one arm. The same living room that had been filled with laughter and clinking glasses just nights ago was now tense with unspoken resentment. Robert sat at the far end of the room, his face still swollen from where George had broken his nose. He shot George a glare, but didn't speak. David and Patrick, sitting near him, were watching closely, muscles tight, waiting for any excuse to get physical. Victor, ever the neutral party, poured himself a drink and leaned against the mantel, trying to appear above the drama. George didn't bother with pleasantries. He walked straight to the center of the room and dropped the folder onto the poker table. "Go ahead," he said. "Take a look." No one moved at first. Then David, impatient as ever, grabbed the folder and pulled out the photos. His face twisted as he flipped through them, his knuckles whitening as he realized what he was looking at. Patrick leaned over his shoulder, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to fury. Robert, still nursing his bruised ego, sneered. "What is this, George? Your little attempt at—" But David wasn't listening anymore. His jaw clenched, his breathing sharp. "Is this a joke?" His voice was low, dangerous. Patrick grabbed the next set of photos, his entire body stiffening. His fingers dug into the paper, nearly crumpling it. "That's my wife," he muttered, voice dark with rage. "That's my goddamn wife." Robert, finally realizing what was happening, snatched a few for himself. His smirk vanished instantly. "Oh, this is good," George said, watching the chaos unfold. "See, while you all were busy treating my wife like a prize at a carnival, I figured I'd get something of my own." David stood, shoving the photos at Patrick. His face was red, veins bulging at his temple. "You slept with Sarah?" he snarled. Patrick didn't even hear him. He was staring at the images, his hands shaking. "And Emma," he looked up at George, disbelief and fury mixing in his expression. George smiled coldly. "They came to me." The tension in the room was suffocating. Sarah and Emma had left their husbands earlier that day, right after George had sent them copies of the images himself. "No explanaciones, no apologies." Just a simple message attached. "We deserve better." And now, the men who had laughed, who had held George down while Robert propositioned his wife, were being ripped apart from the inside. Robert was the first to react. He lunged, but George had expected it. He stepped back just in time, sending Robert stumbling forward instead. "You bastard!" Robert shouted. His nose was still healing, and every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his face. "You think this makes you better than us? You think this makes you a winner?" George shrugged. "No, but it makes us even." David wasn't listening. He was already storming toward the door, fists clenched. "I'm going to find Sarah," he muttered under his breath. Patrick wasn't far behind, his entire body radiating barely contained rage. Emma's got a lot to explain. George just stood there, letting it all unfold. Victor, who had been watching quietly, finally sighed and took a sip of his drink. "Hell of a mess you made, George." George turned to him, smiling faintly. "No, Victor. They made the mess. I just let them drown in it." The next morning, George filed for divorce. He didn't argue. He didn't fight for the house, the furniture, or any of the joint property. He let Megan have it all, every last piece of it. She could have the empty shell of what their life had been. Because as far as George was concerned, he had already won. The ink on the divorce papers had barely dried when George stepped onto the balcony of his new penthouse. 50 stories up, overlooking the city skyline, the world felt different, quieter, cleaner. The chaos of the past was down there somewhere in the streets below, and he had finally risen above it. The place was expensive, $6, $500 a month, but money didn't feel like an issue anymore. Not when it bought him freedom. The open floor plan, the sleek leather furniture, the floor-to-ceiling windows that let the city lights pour in at night. It was the kind of place he had never imagined himself in. Megan would have hated it. Too modern, too impersonal. Perfect. At first, he thought she might try to contact him. Not to apologize, Megan wasn't the type, but maybe to fight for something, to make demands, to act like she had any right to him after what she had done. But she never did. No late-night texts. No dramatic attempts to win him back. Not even an excuse. That should have been a relief, but instead, it was just confirmation of what he already knew. He had always been second place in their marriage. Poker had always come first. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't even surprised. He just didn't care anymore. Sarah and Emma called the night he moved in. "Settling in okay?" Sarah asked, her voice teasing. George leaned back on his couch, swirling a glass of bourbon. "More than okay." Emma chuckled. "I still can't believe you actually went through with it. Just gave her everything and walked away." "She wanted the house," George said. "Let her keep it. I just wanted to be done." There was a pause. Then Sarah's voice, softer this time. "And are you?" George exhaled. "Yeah." And for the first time, he actually meant it. They came over that night. Not for anything serious. None of them wanted that. But for a few drinks, some conversation, and the kind of company that didn't come with strings. And that was all George needed. No more games. No more marriage. Just him, the city, and the kind of freedom that tasted better than any victory. 13 months. That was how long it had been since George last saw Megan. Since he had walked away from their old life and built something new, something untouched by the wreckage she had left behind. He hadn't thought about her much lately. At first, she had occupied every empty space in his mind. Her laugh, her smirk, the way she had always known exactly what cards to play, both at the table and in life. But over time, those memories dulled, fading into something distant, something irrelevant. And then, on a random Friday night, in the bar where they used to celebrate their anniversaries, she walked right back into his life. George had been sipping his bourbon, watching the quiet hum of the room, when he noticed her. She wasn't dressed like she used to be. No flashy outfits, no calculated charm. Just jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back, no poker face in sight. Their eyes met across the bar, and for a split second, he saw something he never expected to see in her again. Regret. She approached slowly, hesitating at first, but then straightening her shoulders like she had made peace with whatever was about to happen. "George," she said softly, standing by his table. He raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Megan," she exhaled, gripping the back of the chair across from him. "Can I sit?" George gestured toward the seat, more curious than anything else. She settled in, folding her hands on the table. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, not tense, not angry, just full of things unsaid. Finally, Megan broke it. "You quit polka?" George blinked, caught off guard. Of all the things she could have started with, that was not what he expected. "Really?" he said flatly. She nodded. "I had to. I went to therapy, spent a long time trying to figure out why I let it take over my life, why I let it destroy us." George swirled his glass, studying her. She looked different, not just in the way she dressed, but in the way she carried herself. There was no performance, no sharp edges in her voice. Megan sighed, looking down at her hands. "I've spent the last year thinking about what I did to you. To us. And she swallowed, glancing up at him. "I was selfish, George. I didn't see it then, but I do now. And I'm so sorry." George let her words settle. He wasn't angry anymore. That had burned out a long time ago. But he wasn't sure what to feel. She smiled sadly. "I just wanted to tell you that. I don't expect anything. I don't deserve anything. But I needed you to know that I get it now." George leaned back, watching her. He believed her. Or at least, he believed that she believed what she was saying. Did it change anything? Not really. But still, maybe it meant something. He sighed, setting his glass down. "All right, Megan. Let's talk. Maybe not as lovers. Maybe not as anything, really. But maybe, just maybe, as two people who once meant the world to each other, trying to figure out what was left." 9 months passed before George saw Megan again. Their first meeting at the bar had ended on neutral terms. No grand declarations, no promises. Just two people finally laying the past to rest. And yet, as much as George had moved on, something lingered. A quiet curiosity. A part of him that wanted to see if she really had changed. So when she called him one evening, asking if he wanted to grab a coffee, he didn't hesitate as long as he thought he would. They met in a small cafe downtown, the kind of place they would have never gone to when they were together. Too quiet, too simple. Megan was different now, not just in how she dressed or spoke, but in the way she listened. She asked him about his life, about work, about his plans. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was sitting across from someone trying to outplay him. They met a few more times after that. A casual lunch here, a walk through the park there. There were no expectations, no rushing into anything. Megan never pushed. She never tried to act like she had a claim to him anymore. And maybe that's what made him trust her again. The night things changed. They were sitting on his balcony, the city stretched out below them. She had just told him about how she had started volunteering at a youth center, working with teenagers who struggled with addiction. "I didn't just lose you, George," she said softly, staring at the skyline. "I lost myself too." He watched her for a long time before responding. "And did you find yourself again?" She smiled, turning to meet his gaze. "I'm trying." That was the moment he knew. A year after their first conversation in the bar, on the 10th anniversary of their first wedding, George and Megan got married again. No big ceremony this time. No extravagant parties, no poker friends, no fancy venue. Just a quiet exchange of vows in a courthouse, followed by dinner at a small restaurant with the only people who truly mattered. Sarah and Emma were there, of course. They had never expected this outcome, but they had been there through it all. They had watched George break, watched him heal, and now they were watching him take a second chance on something most people would have walked away from forever. Megan never gambled again. Not once. It wasn't a promise she made to George. It was a promise she made to herself. And this time, she kept it. The past faded in the way that time allowed it to. Robert disappeared from town, no one quite knowing or caring where he went. David and Patrick stayed with their wives, but the trust was never fully rebuilt. Their marriages became strained, held together more by habit than love. But George and Megan, they built something new, something different, something real. 2 years later, they had a son, and when it came time to choose godparents, the choice was obvious. Sarah, Emma, and their new partners stood beside them, proof that even from the wreckage of the past, something beautiful could still grow. George never thought he'd get a second chance with Megan, but as he sat on the couch, his son sleeping against his chest, Megan curled up beside him, he realized something. Sometimes the best bets in life aren't the ones placed at a table. They're the ones where you risk your heart, knowing this time you won't lose.